Hello, everyone, and welcome to Disrupt. My name is Veronica Medina. I am the producer and curator of this series presented by the Museum of Political Corruption. Thank you all so much for waiting, and sorry for the delay. We actually have a very special group of guests joining us today from all corners of the world, and we had some scheduling issues with the US Daylight Savings. But without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce our first screening event of 2023. This past Wednesday was March 8th. We celebrated International Women's Day, and March is Women's History Month. These are two very important milestones in the recognition of women's struggles and accomplishments throughout history. But most importantly, these commemorations also urge us to acknowledge the fight that we still have ahead of us. A study from the UN Women and the UN ODC estimates that globally more than 81,000 women and girls were killed intentionally in 2021. The numbers for 2022 have not yet been released. But the overall number of female homicides has remained largely unchanged over the past decade. So yes, we still have a great fight ahead of us. But this event is all about celebration. Today, we choose to praise the women, the hundreds of thousands of them from yesterday and from today, who are in the front lines of this fight. Today and every day, we honor them. And this is the spirit of today's discussion, and we are excited to present the film for today's conversation. I Am the Revolution is a poignant portrait of three women fighting for freedom and gender equality in three of the worst countries in the world for women: Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Through a journalistic perspective, the film presents insights into the everyday revolutions that most of us don't get to see or hear about. The revolutions made possible because of the strength of women rising up in remote villages and city streets, challenging the preconceived notions of veiled, silent, and timid women in the Middle East. I hope you have had the chance to see the film ahead of today's discussion, but here's a quick peek at I Am the Revolution.
Phone call, emails, letters, tried to even kidnapped or attacked or killed. I just changed the car, I changed my clothes. قواتنا تهيريجي اغوی پویگی چه خزی متحد شه، چه خزی یو آواز شه، چه خزی باسواد شه، اغوی بیانشه ظلم کولی نور.
همن هر جنك يقو تهولي شورش دبه كي بهر تشتي خود فداي شورش دبه امنتني ام بجن ام رجع يعني سوري حمير صغار بكن بشرا ام جي بزبرن عيني كاربن يعني بيت تشتي قو ماكريه ام بكن وكا ميناك جي بشخورن
سبب الانضمام
بدنا ننظف البلد من هالوسخ هذا كله. بدنا نرجع الحياة مثل الأول وأحسن.
هاي العنف وهاي القسوة هاي المرأة هاي الثورة. احنا عنا أدانا لأنه لن تهدانا في الساحات العامة والكامل للناس. لأن هذا اليوم هو يوم رمز لنضالات المرأة.
Just a feminist? I am just a feminist in the part of the world where all the women are slaves. I am so proud to be just a feminist because what revolution will they do that is harder than the revolution of women?
Joining us today for this important and timely conversation is the film's director and independent journalist, Benedetta Argentieri, and Yanar Mohammed, director of the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, named one of the 100 most influential women in the world in 2018 by the BBC, and one of the freedom fighters portrayed in the documentary. Benedetta, Yanar, I'm so honored and grateful to have you both here with us today. Thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you for inviting us, Veronica.
Benedetta, let me start with you. I know that you've been covering the conflict in the Middle East for almost a decade now. And so when did the idea to work on this film come about, and what was the process like to finding and selecting these particular activists and then obviously getting them on board?
Well, first of all, thanks for organizing this panel. It's really a pleasure. And for me, it's a really honor, like, to still continue talking about this film after almost like 5 years from when we started shooting on the ground, and then 4 years since we released it. And that, really kind of gives us a lot of motivations not to continue the work that we're doing, but most importantly, that it's a proof that this is something that is very important to talk about, because what is happening is really changing and shaping like the way we think about women's struggle. And I think that on this on this topic, a lot step forwards, I do not know if you then agree with me, that have been made in the past decade. So the idea of this film really started when I first met Yanar in New York. She came to New York to talk at the UN, and I had the privilege to go and meet her and interview her, and it was a very kind of changing moment for me, because we had a very intense conversation, and then she started telling me about what the work that she was making on the ground. So that, combined to all my travel that I have done in both in Iraq and Syria, I started really to think about how the women in the Middle East were portrayed by Western media mainstream, especially during 2012 and 13. There was this image of a frail woman, often veiled in refugee camps, just waiting for a savior. This was more or less, the image, the narrative that was coming out. But I knew that there were, movements, but strong women leading, movements and empowering other women on the ground. So this is really how, the idea came together. And also to see how the women's struggle was connected and is connected, is not divided by borders as we think, but there is a link always, between different movements. So this is really how we started to think about it. And the process, of course, as a filmmaker, I imagine also it's usually very long, and sometimes you can have some step backwards, fundings and everything else. But we made it in like 2 years time, which was a really good, and fast process overall. And yes, and here we are.
And Yanar, what was it like for you to participate in the film as a, to have your fight and your life being portrayed? And what were some of the most crucial outcomes from the film, not just for you, but for your organization, but particularly for your fight?
Let me say that when I first met Benedetta, I felt comfortable. I was able to speak out my mind, and she understood me, and I didn't need to do much convincing for her. And that by itself brought me closer to this work. And of course, Benedetta is very persistent in her work. She would go everywhere that we go, whether it's a demonstration, whether it's in our office, at work, or even at home, how we make tea. So Benedetta was that kind of a feminist, let's say revolutionary feminist, who understood what we wanted, and we didn't need to I didn't need to present any apologize for any part of our work when I was explaining it to her. That was many years ago. And since that time and until now, I love the way how she captured the dilemma, the sentences that reflected our dilemma as women living in the Middle East, in that part of the Middle East where the American war took place, where the U.S. American war took place, and where the extremist fundamentalist government was put in place, and where women were like just had to live with their daily suffering, and nobody would want to hear about it anymore because Iraq is sort of like the forgotten story. But Benedetta came there, and she was able to see how women are suffering in their daily life, and she wanted to listen as to
Mhm.
how our local point of view and perspective was about it. And I liked that. She was very persistent in the work, and she took the sentences that I was unable to speak in other places, and she put them into this film, which was quite smart.
If I may,
It's always
Veronica.
interesting to hear the dynamic of how that comes about. Yes, Benedetta, please.
No, I just wanted to say that, I didn't touch upon a very important point that all of the three countries that we want, and shoot and following women's, they all had in common, as you said at the beginning, yes, the really worst places, but at the same time, there are all places where American interventions has been there for several years, whether in terms of occupation or, invading army or whatever you want to put it, but there's been a long presence of the Americans, and this was also, I think, very important to highlight, like the way that US intervention has actually made the situation worse for women in most of the cases.
Right. No, and it's interesting because obviously the three characters that you chose to follow, they each have their own set of risks that they are they have, they're persecuted, they're targets, and so I really would love to hear from you. What was the process like in the filming? Because obviously you had to schedule your filming ahead of time. You were dealing with three different countries, so the logistics also might be complicated. With everything, but how was it like for you to be able to follow their schedule, which is alone must be very complex, their agendas, and also, but to be able to keep their security and not to disclose their location? And as you could see, some of the meetings were happening in very like under wraps, nobody would know about them. So what was it like for you to be able to follow that schedule, organize the filming in a way that would keep their safety and your safety of everybody involved, and while also maintaining all the filming on the wraps, all the production of the film on the wraps?
I mean, the approach that we use is, first of all, to have a deep understanding with the friends that we were filming, how to do this, because we didn't, of course, wanted to, weaken their security or expose places. And so we followed, the lead of each character on this, and it was fine. Also, there is a lot of perils, first of all, of security, and then, people following and these kind of things. So we kind of, trust, and there was a mutual trust in this, that we had to work on it. And was one thing. And then, like, my approach in filming is always to be a fly on a wall. So I never wanted anybody to do anything particular because we were there, but just to follow the daily life. And I think that this was the most important as well, with the challenges that each character was meeting every day. And so this was really, I think, a good situation to not just interfere. Also, because I personally do not like filmmakers who actually interfere too much in the process of filming or showing themselves too much. There, we were just observer, no, and it was a great privilege for me and for all of us. We were one of the first team of all woman team on the ground in Iraq, and especially in Baghdad, it was very sometimes challenging, and we was like, everybody was looking at us in very weird ways, and also that was actually a process in itself, because the industry was telling me, no, there is no way that you're going to find a DP coming to you with you in these countries, because there aren't any women's DP doing this, which I knew that it was not true. But after a while of research, we were able to find a woman DP able to come as well, and the reason to have an all-woman team was mainly, well, first of all, it was a technical thing as well. Men are usually much bigger than women, especially in that part of the world, and I really didn't want the camera looking downwards to anybody. But also, it's a question of trust. No, we are entering in a woman's world, and we should respect that as well. And so this is how it was.
Well, I have to confess, I find it very fascinating and terrifying at the same time. And so I really admire the work that you've done, and I commend your bravery and all of your crew. And obviously, speaking of bravery, Yanar, and actually taking a quote from the film, and I think was when activist Saleh Ghaffar said at one point that no revolution achieves victory without sacrifice. And it was also deeply touching for me in the film when Rojda Felat said, she's the activist from Syria, and then she said that after her city was liberated, it was not like she went on and got married, but she didn't want to quit the revolution, and so she actually moved on to help free other communities, right? So it is about sacrifice. And what have been some of the biggest sacrifices that you had to do for your revolution?
The revolution that I would like to dig into and speak about comes in many stages. The first one was after the US invasion of Iraq, and that was 20 years ago when George Bush said he will be liberating the women of Iraq, but in reality, we all got covered and had to go back to our homes and quit work and education, and the situation became difficult for the women of Iraq. So, speaking against that and speaking against the violence, setting up the first network of shelters for women in Iraq, all of that was an initiative of resistance to the extreme right wing that ruled in Iraq. That was the first one. But then again, you find that every few years you have a new revolution to plan. For example, when ISIS conquered western part of Iraq, well, conquered Mosul, and women became merchandise to buy and sell among ISIS. And these are Iraqi women, and they are our sisters and cousins and people that we know. So for every stage, we had to plan, what do we say? What do we do? How do we save women from that part of the country? And how do we address it to the patriarchs in the government? And we find that every other year the government puts a ban on us or a lawsuit against us, or they I currently have an arrest warrant against me in Baghdad. That's why I'm in Canada now. I'm not speaking from Baghdad. It's not on me only, but it's also against three of my colleagues. And they have just sent us a letter today that we have to close our organization for 30 days because we have some breaches. What are these breaches? They don't have to explain to us. They don't feel accountable to us to say anything. So when you are that resistance to the liberation of women and also the liberation of all of your society, and when you decide to be on the front line, it's a sacrifice where you have to let go of your personal freedom, of your the way that you run your life, and you become a freedom fighter, whether you like it or not, and it tags on and on and on for many years. It's not only myself, but I would say very proudly that sometimes it starts with a few people, but then it becomes dozens and hundreds. And there are many of us now in Iraq. And I would say our shelters have saved more than 1,300 women. And a good number of those women are standing with us. And we consider ourselves that in the time of Islamic oppression in Iraq, we are the revolution. We, the women, the secular women, the feminist women who stand on the front line and who would not back off. So Benedetta came in the right time, in the right place. She asked the right questions, and she was so persistent that we couldn't say no. And she did it.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I like the most about the film is that Benedetta, you're really able to capture the reality of these freedom fighters, right? In a way that you honor them. They are definitely heroes, people that we can look up to and be like, grateful that there are so many women in the front lines and willing to go through all these sacrifices. But at the same time, you did it in a way that you don't necessarily glorify or glamorize them, because there is really nothing glamorous about being threatened or persecuted. And just kind of, expanding on what Yanar was just saying, and especially now with the stage where documentary films are, there is a huge trend of trying to make documentaries ever more entertaining and suitable for the streamers, and so it's becoming a fine line to really show the characters, to portray them in a very faithful way, as opposed to put them as this, glorified version of themselves and completely detract from what the reality is. So I just wanted to point that out and say, how important that kind of work is, and I appreciate that you've done that. And so, you're also saying that these revolutions come in cycles, and obviously a lot has happened since the film came out in 2018. All of these countries have been through a lot in the last few years. So, are you able to give us an update on where these activists are with the work? Obviously, Yanar can speak for herself now, but do you have any updates on where Saleh Ghaffar and Rojda Filat are and what they're doing?
Yes, so Rojda Filat is still in the YPG, in the unit, defense unit for women. And she is at the moment, well, she, of course, okay, so when we, all right, let me rephrase. In 2017, when we were shooting, she was, leading the campaign to retake Raqqa, the so-called capital of the Islamic State in Syria. And after winning that, she continued the fight against the Islamic State until 2019. In 2019, though, like Turkey started attacking northern eastern Syria, so she started engaging in that, war. So she is still on the ground, she's still fighting, and at the moment, they are facing basically two major and like enemies, which is one is the Islamic State, because despite the fact that it was defeated on the ground in 2019, but the ideology is very much still there. It's the group is regrouping in both Syria and Iraq, and the threat is still very much there. And then there is this constant, this really low intensity war that is going on with Turkey, in the sense that Turkey is bombing and using drones against northern eastern Syria, assassinating key people in the administration or in the armed forces. And these are the allies or also the United States, which makes it a little bit, confusing the situation, to say the least. While Saleh Ghaffar, as you know, since the US retreat and handing over the power to the Taliban, the situation for women has completely deteriorated in a very kind of shocking way, in a way as well, after 20 years of occupation and of the United States, a promise that also, exactly like in Iraq, to liberate women, and actually it did exactly the opposite. Salai is not in Afghanistan anymore, but in Afghanistan there is a very important organization that's called the Revolutionary Afghan Women Association that is still there. All the members are still there. And it's an organization that has been going on since 1978 for liberation of women. And their work is all completely underground, and they're still doing it with all the difficulties, of course.
Mm-hmm. What happened to Salat's party that have been dismantled because of?
So like it's been banned from Afghanistan, but also the party is still there. No, it's still working within the civil society. Of course, the situation,
Mm-hmm.
the security situation in general, has deteriorated as well. Despite that there are not anymore the Taliban's doing the attack, but now it's ISIS making attacks on the Taliban. And plus, there are a lot of problems because of the tribal issues and tribal fragmentation in Afghanistan. So it's really kind of brewing like a lot of tension. And the Taliban's right now, they promised that after March 20, which is Nowruz, like New Year's Day for many cultures, basically they're gonna ease up a little bit on like the oppression on civil society in general, and they claim that the bans for girls' schools might be lifted or these kind of things, but of course nobody really believes them. So we will have to see, how it unfolds, because there is also the problem that they are on the brink of a famine. Basically, there are no more money, there is no more food, and the population is really, really suffering.
And Yanar, are you able to provide us an update on your organization, especially because you said that you're not the only one receiving threats right now, but the Iraqi government is actually funneling in with other leaders of your organization as well. What is the last news on that?
One of my colleagues had her family home raided at 2 after midnight. And the accusation was, and this is a very funny accusation. You know how we run an operation of sheltering women from violence? So they took this matter and they twisted it around. They call us human traffickers in the time when we have the only shelters that save women from honor killing and from violence in Iraq. So one of my colleagues had her family home raided after midnight, telling them, well, luckily she was not there at the time. So her family were told that she's a human trafficker and she will have to come and surrender to the police station. And they said that they have arrest warrants against 4 of us, herself and 3 of us, myself included. So instead of organizing for International Women's Day, which we've been living this situation for a whole month of terror and trying to get the right lawyers to address the issue and to defend ourselves. So what happens that under an extremist government, you, instead of being the activist who is defending women's freedom, you find that you have to defend yourself, that you are not a criminal. They put this accusation on you that you are a criminal who is buying and selling women, and they put the name tag on it, human trafficker. So this is what we've been suffering from for a whole month. And today we get an email that they are planning to shut down our organization. So if we go back to the roots of it, I would say again that 20 years ago, and again in this month of March, when the war started on Iraq and when the invaders came, the American and the British invaders, they chose the social structures of tribals and religious institution to be ruling Iraq. And both structures, they predate the modern state of Iraq or any other state. So how would women be thriving or living under the tribal and the religious institution? It's very tough. They sort of threw us under the bus. So from that time and until now, our organization of women's freedom in Iraq, we find that we are the front line of defending women, of telling them that we should have a say about the future of Iraq, and we also provide the alternative for women who are suffering from violence to come and to have some dignity, live their life in dignity. And you would think, oh, sheltering is just a service. And many people around the world, the UN included, the United Nations also look at it as a service for women. But in a country where every day more than 3 or 4 women are being killed, and in a country where sheltering women is banned, and the fact that women have to submit to patriarchal orders and violence is the way that the government is ruling, shelters are not a service. Shelters are a title of women's resistance to extremism, to oppression and to all the ways in which the extreme right rules the country. So we think of ourselves as that frontline resistance towards a very much right-wing government that rules in the name of religion and in the name of patriarchy. Let me put it that way. Tribalism is patriarchy. So patriarchy and religion are ruling Iraq, and women have become like the price to pay between tribes. Sometimes when there is a dispute and they want to solve it, they were in Iraq. We have something called fasliya, which means you resolve your problems through paying this many women to the other tribe. So women have also turned into a currency in these situations. And they want to ban us, just like they did in Afghanistan when Benedetta speaking about how the organization was banned. Meanwhile, now they are in the first steps of trying to ban our organization and to shut down our shelters for women. So women do not have anywhere to go, and thereby they control half the population. They just have the other half to deal with and to oppress in other ways.
Yeah, you actually get into an issue that I wanted to kind of go into a little bit, which is what are some of the tactics that they do besides obviously being the power, the state, in power. So besides using the state, what are some of the other tactics that they use to keep this other 50% of the population aligned with them? And as you said, that they're about to close the shelters and these women have another place to go. They're, at extreme risk right now. So what are some of the options that you're looking into? What are some of the outcomes that you might foresee? And what are the things that you were trying to do to avoid a major, a major tragedy?
This question is for me, right?
Yeah.
You might find it very funny that we have to reach out eventually to the international community and remind them that you have placed this government in Iraq and you promised the whole world that Iraq has become democratic. And you have put the constitution in place and the laws in place, and you have you put together something called the NGO Directorate. Did you mean that it was the NGO Oppression Directorate? Because that's how it's happening. Now, this NGO Directorate is banning us from work. So we are reaching out to the UN, to the donor countries, to the government of Iraq, and we are reminding them of their obligation when they promised democracy. Was that a total lie? Or was there any truth to it? So we try to reach out to the international community. We have also hired our lawyers who are going through the judicial mechanism and trying to show the truth about how the governmental agencies are bringing up lies against us. Like, who is a human trafficker? When you save an adult woman's life and you put her in a safe place and you empower her, you give her lessons of literacy or other lessons, and then you give her a job, how is that human trafficking? So we are going through the courts. We have hired the lawyers. We are waiting patiently in our homes while we are in hiding. I mean, I am in another country, but my colleagues are in hiding. And meanwhile, we spoke to the some of the embassies, including the American embassy, where they say that they might look into it. So the UN is speaking to us, and they are more positive, and they say they can address something to the court. But meanwhile, it's been a month, and we're still hiding. This is the new democracy of Iraq.
And yeah, I mean, you said it so well, both of you, that obviously that this gender-based violence is something that is so historically embedded, these ultra-conservative values that have been inherited from the religious fundamentalism, and in many cases, especially in traditional cultures like you see in the Middle East. But what we're seeing right now is all of these Western countries that have always considered themselves democratic, have been going through this awakening of a new ultra-conservative movement, and religious extremism is on the rise, especially in the Americas and some countries in Europe. So, Benedetta, you have been reporting on this for so long, especially from these fundamentalist states. How do you see this rise of the conservative extremism in Europe and in the United States?
Well, I think that in general, we will have to think about a little bit more in depth what do we mean about democracy when we talk about democracy. And what we have seen in the past 20 years, at least, is the failure of liberal democracy in so many different ways. And I think that, certain kind of movements, especially, ultra conservative, right wing extremism, is also a reaction to that. It's a way that we are starting to see how, like when you have elections that half of the population doesn't vote, what do we mean by this? I think that there is a need for a bigger discourse, and also starting to think that maybe this system is not really the ones that is working for everyone. But then we get into a geopolitical, more broadened kind of understanding of this. We have seen how the war on women is being carried out not just in the Middle East but everywhere. The canceling the abortions rights. So like we've seen an erosion of rights, all over Western democracy. The ones that they say that they want to export democracy, but which kind of democracy are they exporting? Because this is also creating a lot of problems in how we think about governing and how we trust, the system in general. And I think that we've seen it in the US, in Brazil, we've seen it in Italy. There is a huge chunk of population that does not believe in the system anymore at all, and they try to vote for the most reactionaries as well, the ones that promise the most, or that brings everything to the extreme. It doesn't matter if they then don't do what they're supposed to, but sometimes they do, and it's really not, we see a destruction of environment, we see an erosion of rights in general, and it's very worrisome to see countries going the right wings. But I think that this is really like what is gonna happen in the next 10 years. Like there is an advancement of what is also being called how do you say, authoritarian capitalism. Like countries with China and Russia, using capitalist system, but not bringing democracy, because the tales that they always told us is that capitalism can just work in a democracy, but this is not really true. So again, I think it's a very difficult situation, and I think that in general, we've seen that there are a lot of movements. There are a lot of people on the streets all over the world, and right now what we're focusing on, rightly so, I think, also is the women's revolutions, the ones that are led by women, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's like in a lot of different countries. You see that women are on the forefront, but also because they've been oppressed for so long that now it's time, to start thinking a world in which includes women in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yanar, you actually said in a moment in the film that, I think I'm quoting, like that we needed that kind of extremism like ISIS to open our eyes. And then do you believe that this current extremism that we're seeing that the Western country is also kind of a wake-up call? And if so, how?
I was watching the television on CNN when Donald Trump's group were invading the White House. And surprisingly enough, it took only a month afterwards, or it was in the same year, that a group of Islamists, a sect in Baghdad, were invading the Green Zone. And the tactics were similar. They did not care for the results of the elections. They thought it is ours to take, and they did not even respect their own rules. Let's put it that way. So the right wing is rising in everywhere around the world, and still the governments should be accountable for their for giving the constitutional rights of the people, and for providing for let's say, in a country in Iraq, where we are one of the richest countries in the world in oil, why should the people be living a situation of joblessness and poverty? In 2019, in October of 2019, there was a major uprising in Iraq in which the whole society took place. Millions of people were on the streets, and they wanted a total change of the government. So the people are doing their duty, and they are pushing for a change. But also the extreme right wing always has its ways of containing the uprisings, and of throwing one face of the rulers in the garbage while keeping the system. So we had witnessed that, just like many countries in our region have witnessed the Arab Spring. So what to do is to continue with the resistance, and do it in the ways that we understand, to not to submit to the oppression and fear of them as being too strong and we are too weak. No, it should not be that way. Every person should have a right to a good life, and woman, man, and everybody. And we find that because women have lived with the oppression, and because we understand the imbalance in the power struggle, we know best how to find the ways to keep a foothold in the society, and to revolt when the time comes. So when the second uprising will come, we will be again in the front lines, whatever this NGO directorate, whatever these governmental agencies do against us. Women will always be there. It's, the 21st century is the women's century, and it should stay that way. And I guess that's why we're meeting here on this page.
Absolutely. And, what's one thing that strikes me is that obviously religious fundamentalism is not something new. We've had all sorts of fundamentalism throughout history. But do you feel that is there anything that makes this new wave of fundamentalism and conservatism and authoritarianism different this time? Is that the use of technology? Is that the fact that the ultra-right is now extremely organized and creating alliances all over the world? We see, ultra-conservative Christians mingling with, ultra-conservative Muslims. What do you identify as something that's unique to this wave of conservatism? And I think Yanar mentioned a little about who are going to be in the front lines, and women are definitely going to be leading on this. But what are some of the other strategies that this time allow us to have? What kind of powers we now have that we didn't have before, and how can we better strategize to disrupt the system once and for all? Both of you, either one can answer.
You want to go for it, Benedetta?
No, Yanar, go first, and then I can go. No worries.
The extreme right wing is taking the opportunity of the weakened revolutionaries of the world, of them not being united, and they are putting their hands on power in every country, because the leftist groups are not so much in the front lines anymore. And this is the times when we have to think of the issue in a more social way, as to who is the resistance on the ground. It is those who are losing. those who are not leading a good life, a life with dignity. So when we look at it, it's the women, but not only the women. The working class is losing more and more while the years pass. And there are many parts of the population who are treated with more oppression. And in every country, you have the marginalized, so-called minorities, marginalized minorities who have to suffer from an attack or from being continuously disempowered. So we look at the new resistance of the 21st century as a combination of the resistance of the women, of the working class, of the marginalized, marginalized, what so-called minorities, and also as an anti-racist fight. If you put all these groups together and there is an understanding that the enemy is common among these groups, I mean, our numbers are much bigger than our rulers. So it just needs a bit of organizing for the formula to change. Why should all the Iraqi oil money go to those who are ruling Iraq to make them filthy rich while the people are suffering from hunger and poverty? So the numbers should give us the answer. We just need to be more organized. It's yours, Benedetta, now.
Yes, I very much agree, about organization. Organizing is one of the first practice of self-defense, and we've seen how over, in the past, 20, 30 years, we see a fragmentation of society, isolation, individualism, that especially in the Western world was one of the main obstacles of for a movement, left, we can call it leftist movement, but movements of people that actually believe in civil rights, that want to fight against inequality, because this is a very important anti-colonialist, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, like all of these different forces that have been historically fragmented and unable to find a unity within diversity. And this is, I think, it's very important. If really, we've seen, as Yanar said, they are coming, but they're coming everywhere, and if there is not an understanding that together we can actually fight back, everything that is happening in the world that is disastrous, then it will be very difficult. And we have, of course, some of the practices remain like from like the early in the centuries, whether it's demonstrations, they are still, very much in use, but we also need to start thinking about a hyper globalized world, because we do live in, we have never been so connected where, but at the same time, we feel so alone. Why is it that? I think that this is something, that it's a question that anybody who wants to live a different type of life should ask themselves, because just like this, we are able to find, a unity. I mean, of course, we've seen, like in different countries, different things happening. But yeah, unless there is also a change, especially in a place like the US, in which the how do you say, the influence that the US has around the world is like crazy, and so if nothing changes also there, it's going to be really, really difficult. But also we've seen how, this hegemony has been deteriorating, towards like, especially with the war in Ukraine and Russia is coming out. There are a lot of different things happening, and the governments right now, for instance, in the name of the war of Ukraine, are spending billions and billions of dollars in military spending, completely neglecting their own society. And this is really problematic also because there is no end in sight of this. While with the war in Ukraine, everything else has disappeared, as if, the world is still because the war in Ukraine is happening. And this is not true. It's a very European, Western-centric views of the world that is also very troubling, because there is no understanding that it's much bigger than this.
Well, the way that they get power is by making us think that we are so fragmented, and if we continue to think within our borders, obviously we're going to be fragmented. I mean, look at Brazil, we are extremely divided. Look what happened in the last elections in the US, extremely divided. So if we kept looking beyond our borders, I think we will see what Yanar is talking about. We are definitely much more numbers than our rulers. And it's just a matter of understanding how international, how global, and how it's not a political issue within a specific country. It's a political issue within our own societies in general. And I think that's also the power of connectedness through the internet or other these new technologies, is that we're able to see that a country that looks so different from myself, being in Brazil, I can look at the Middle East and feel like they're completely different, but all their underlying issues are the same. And if you look at the root of the cause, they're much more similar than we think. And so,
just I wanted to add something. I think that one of the main issues that we have in societies now in general, that there is a lack of hope. And if there is no hope, people are not really, to regive hope is, almost like a success, because that means, you want to participate in this. The problem of the fragmentation, of course, yes, of course, we are much more in terms of numbers, but how many people, they don't really commit, or they don't really want to go out, they don't want to really expose themselves, they don't believe that another way is possible. And regiving the hope is something extremely important. And this was one of the reasons, I think, as a feedback of this film, that we showed a lot around the world, but each time I participated, there were like really young women coming, to me and say, okay, I want to struggle too. And this, I think, is like extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And leading the conversation, I feel like we've been letting the ultra-right conservatives taking on the discussions and really kind of take over the rhetoric. Instead of coming on with our own ideas, we are only concerned about responding to what they are talking about. And that's when we lose the power. And that's when we, instead of going forward and saying, no, this is the way forward, we keep saying that's not the way, but we need more of a propositive perspective, than as opposed to just a responsive to whatever they are leading. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones with the microphone in their hands, they're the ones who keep pushing their ideas forward, and we're just here trying to negate and not necessarily offering another way out. And I think what you say, Benedetta, is exactly that. Like, we just feel powerless and we feel like we have no say in this discussion, when it should be the other way around. But enough of us talking. Let's listen from our audience. I think we can get some discussion, some questions from them. Yanar, were you personally inspired? How were you personally inspired to lead this revolution?
Sometimes some people plan out their lives since they are young. They have this dream, oh, I will become this person when I get old. But most of the time, you find that people kept on pushing you until you were at the beginning or the start of a crowd. And sometimes the bombs are very convincing also. You're just living in your house peacefully, thinking that you are a mother of a baby, you are a wife, and you have a job and you're fine. And all of a sudden the American bombs come and hit you on the head. And some of us had the support of our families to be educated and have the tools to speak out. And some of us have that gender passion, where I feel I should be defending those females who I see enslaved in my country now. So when you put all of these things together, I think the question has almost 20 answers. Putting them all together, or what they say as a dialectic view of how we become what we become, is the result of our past, our present, all the dilemmas that we went through, and the opportunities that came in front of us. And what to do with them and where to take them in the future is a totally different question. But this is who we are. It's hard to tell exactly where it started, whether it was chemistry or it was the opportunities. I think it was a combination of all these things together. Thank you for the question.
And we have another question from Scott Osborne. Thank you for being with us, Scott. Does anyone want to comment on the experience of Shireen Ebadi, the first Muslim woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize, but subsequently exiled from Iran?
I would say Shireen Ebadi is a very courageous woman who spoke against patriarchy in her government, and she spoke it while she was living inside the country and under the rule of Islamic Republic of Iran. It was very courageous of her, and she had to sacrifice her being inside the country and to just leave. So our respect for her sacrifices and for her work for women. And it's difficult once you step outside the country. It's difficult to affect where politics go after that. They sort of kick you out of your revolution. And we worry very much about the fact that we can be kicked out, like if they want to arrest you and you feel you cannot go back to the country, that's another way. Um, I would say Shireen had the respect that she deserved from the Nobel Prize institution, and many revolutionary women in the Middle East have given as many sacrifices, but I don't think the Nobel Prize would go for revolutionary women.
And we actually have two last questions, but they are kind of, I'm going to try to combine them here. One is asking from Michael Genovese, how are each of the organizations in the film funded by NGOs, individual donors, foundations? And Marcia Costa is asking, good afternoon, how can the international community engage in this revolution? How can we help? I think you talked a little bit about that in more of the institutional side of things, but what is the civil society can do? And if these foundations or if the organizations are also somehow being able to be supported by people, how can we participate in that?
I would like to point out that there are feminists around the world who care, who have the feminist solidarity at the core of their daily work and thinking. We have allies based in New York, the organization of Madri, who introduced Benedetta to me. They have been major supporters for us, and so has some agencies who are assigned to do this work. Some of them in the UN, working within the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, and we have support from the Netherlands and a few others. I would say not too many, groups in the world do support women's revolution. So that was about the first question. Let me see what the second question was.
It was, how can the international community engage and how can we help?
It would be very nice of Women, Peace and Security of the UN Security Council to send a letter to the NGO Directorate and to the Prime Minister of Iraq, asking them why they are not allowing feminists to do their work on the ground and to save women's lives when the government is not doing it. There are no governmental shelters for women that are accessible. They have something like a prison. It's not a shelter. So the Women, Peace and Security from the UN Security Council could ask that question. And many governments can ask the Iraqi government that question. So that kind of support would be really appreciated. And the Iraqi government cannot continue doing what they're doing if not if without the support of the donor community, the American government, the British government, and those come in the front line. If they ask the Iraqi government, why are you doing this to the women, it would stop. This government was put in place by the invaders, by the imperialist attack on Iraq. So they would listen to those who installed them in place.
And what about people like us, the audience for today's events? A lot of our, membership in the museum. Is there anything that civil society can do? How can we engage, and how can we help echo the work that you guys are doing?
Would you like to speak about it, Benedetta, or let me
I
give a bit of a response before I give you the microphone?
Yeah, please.
The civil society can always support by, of course, there is the financial support that we all know about, and we do have our allies in the US. For those who are in the US, the organization of Madre, who have always supported us, and our survival throughout the years was not possible without them. So speak to them. There are always ways to support us. And the third one is the political one, through asking, giving, forwarding the question to the Prime Minister of Iraq and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs as to why are you so extremist with the women of Iraq? Why is the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq not allowed to work and not allowed to open shelters that are the only shelters for women in Iraq?
Yeah, I think that there is an aspect that the international community, can really support is through showing solidarity. And solidarity can be shown in different ways, whether it's financial, whether it's like organizing events, so like in which basically talk about the situation. Because in general, like as we are bombarded by so many different news, I think in general people are pretty ignorant about what's going on around them, because it's sometimes even overwhelming to follow everything. That being said, there are certain things and certain issues that needed to be followed. They need to follow up and, show this solidarity, engage, whether it's with your congressman or, Congress members, or, do something. There are always different possibilities. And I wanted to also tackle the first questions about both Afghanistan and northern eastern Syria. So for Afghanistan, like the diaspora, European diaspora plays a major role in funding and the movements in general, and this is true also for northern eastern Syria. But and then there are like NGOs and specific projects that are not maybe superficial, but they are helping, funding the organizations. And I think that this is, important for Afghanistan. Although, like Shalai Ghaffar and the party in general is being very skeptical about this. NGOs process, especially in Afghanistan, that basically took away the agencies of local women by imposing certain customs on how to do things that really kind of either pacify the struggles that they were making or really completely void it. So that was a little bit of, what they were explaining that to me. And for northern eastern Syria, it's a little bit different because the armed forces, so Roj Dafilat and the Women's Protection Unit are part of a political project, so a part of a much broader kind of also because they have the territory under the control. And this is, they are not having a nation state, not having a government. It's like it really does make a huge difference on how you approach also the struggle. So like for them, the fundings come for sure from the European diaspora, but also the fact that they're able to construct a new kind of economy, whether it's like in growing start they, for instance, northern eastern Syria, before there was nothing was cultivated in their lands, and now they're starting to cultivate for internal purposes and trying in these ways. So I mean, in general, I think it's there is also a responsibility from, in general, the international community, not of course not the civil society, and we needed to ask them for, accountability as well for what happened in these places.
Right, absolutely. And obviously continue to follow your work in their social media or, other screenings of other films that Benedetta has worked on. And this is a little bit what we're trying to do here, is to really broaden the conversation and bring attention to these issues that a lot of times get lost in all of the sound bites that we hear all the time. So unfortunately, this is all the time we have for our discussion today. And with that, I wanted to thank you both again, Benedetta, Yanar, so much for being here. It has been a great honor to have you here, and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, thank you all so much for tuning in today and for participating in this discussion. Please leave any comments or suggestions below. Click on the like button so we will know that you are liking our free program. And also you can subscribe to our channel and you'll get notifications for all of our upcoming events. Disrupt will be back in a couple of months with yet another impactful film screening and discussion. I hope I'll see you then. And thank you. Have a good Sunday.